Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Webinar Wednesdays with PKD Foundation Chief Scientific Officer David Barron. I'm Alexis Denny, and I work in the Research and Education Department here at the PKD Foundation. And I'll be with you throughout the talk, so if you have any trouble, you can message me via your chat box or email me at education@pkdcure.org for help. We're also live tweeting throughout the event, so be sure to follow us at PKD Foundation and tweet Sarah questions using the hashtag Webinar Wednesdays. She'll add your questions to the queue to be answered at the end. Today, David will be talking about the function of kidneys and why they're so important. I see that you've already submitted some questions, and so we will get to that a little bit later. But during the presentation, if you do have questions, you can type your comments into the chat panel on the right side of your screen, or you can tweet them to us, and we'll do that Q&A at the end. Please note that the PKD Foundation does not offer medical advice, and the information shared this afternoon is not intended to be a substitute for consultations with your health professional. Care and treatment decisions related to your health must be made on consultation with your doctor and health professional team. We are recording this webinar and will archive it on our website within the next few days. Thanks so much, and I will hand it over to David.
Well, hello to everybody. I'm going to give a basic introduction to kidney function. This is by no means complete, but I hope to cover what the kidney basically does. And the kidneys are located actually towards your back. They're protected in part by the rib cage. And as you can see in this first illustration, both on the left, where you see how they're placed in the body, they're actually higher up than probably some of you thought they were. And you'll also notice that the left kidney sits a little higher than the right kidney. And this can be an issue for surgery, not a big issue, but it often determines, for example, if a living donor is going to give a kidney, this particular anatomical difference might determine which kidney is donated. The kidney is connected to the bloodstream through the aorta and the inferior vena cava. These are among the biggest vessels in your body, and that's because the kidneys get roughly 25% of the total output of the heart. So each time your heart beats, that blood is flowing to the kidneys to be filtered. And the kidneys are also very metabolically active, meaning they take up a lot of the oxygen from your blood to do what they do. And you can see that occasionally the renal arteries are single vessels, but they often bifurcate, meaning they divide in two, and you can see this on your screen, both on the left and the right in this case. And when the blood goes into the kidney, of course, it has to return, and that is through the veins, the renal veins that empty into the inferior vena cava and go back to the heart to be reoxygenated by the lungs and pumped out again. And the kidneys are actually rather pretty when you look at them in cross-section, and you see the left kidney sort of cut in two, and you can see how there's a cortex, which is the lighter pink, and a medullary area, which is a darker pink, and then the pelvis of the kidney is where the urine collects and ultimately drains down the ureter into your bladder. And this is, you can also see that the kidneys are high up because they're sitting just below your diaphragm, which sort of separates your thorax, where your lungs and heart are, from your abdomen, where your kidneys and GI tract and liver are. You would not see these kidneys, by the way, if the liver were shown in this illustration, because the kidneys sit rather far back. And you'll also see, and I won't comment on it much today, the adrenal glands, which sit on the top of the kidney. They're called adrenal because of their location on top of the kidney. And they're also very important endocrine organs that secrete hormones that are actually vital to your life. Now, what do the kidneys do? Well, one task is pretty obvious, and you all know what that is. And all normal kidneys, and many but not all diseased kidneys, do make urine. There are cases in end-stage renal disease where the kidneys are no longer capable of making urine, but many people who need dialysis or a transplant at the time of renal replacement therapy, their kidneys are still making urine. It's just not effectively filtering your blood. So that urine does not contain the toxins in your blood that would normally be eliminated, and that's why you need renal replacement therapy. Urine has been a diagnostic tool actually for millennia, based on color, smell, clarity or clearness, taste. There's a term for this, amaroli. Some people believe that drinking urine is actually medicinal. That occurs in various countries. Won't comment further on that, but some physicians early on did taste urine because if it was sugary, that was an indication of disease. Frequency of urination is obviously important. It varies from person to person. If it's too frequent, it can indicate infection. If it's not very frequent at all, it probably means you're not drinking enough, and that relates to quantity. And then there's the act of urination itself. Is it painful? Normally, and this is a talk about normal kidney function, there should be no pain associated with urination. Hesitancy, that's usually not your kidneys at all, but in males in particular, that may be indications of prostate issues. The strength of flow, again, that may be an issue of your urinary bladder. And whether you completely empty your bladder is also important, because if you don't, that urine, which is normally sterile, and again we're talking about normal kidneys, if it sits there for too long, it can become infected. So these are all the sorts of things that on a normal checkup a good physician might be looking at, although I don't think these days anybody is tasting urine anymore, at least not in the Western world. So what do the kidneys do other than the obvious? Well, the urine is made because it is the result of filtering the blood. Really, all the blood that circulates through your body ends up in the kidneys. It's filtered, and the waste that accumulates from eating, from exercising, in other words, when your muscles work hard, they generate certain molecules that you have to get rid of. This all occurs in the kidney. So filtration is one of the first and foremost things that the kidney does, and I'll speak more to what this looks like anatomically. And I'd like to introduce a term, homeostasis, and this is really a wide-ranging term. I'm going to talk about it in terms of kidneys, but homeostasis has to do with how you and your body deal with your external environment. Homeostasis is really the ability of an organism to maintain its own internal equilibrium by adjusting its physiological processes. And just to stray a little from the kidney, if it's cold out, you shiver to raise your body temperature. If you're at high altitude, you may breathe more often to maintain your oxygen. These are all examples of homeostasis. But getting back to the kidney, what homeostasis is keeping your water-soluble molecules, and namely, and very simply put, the amount of salt in your blood, that's maintained by the kidney. And you want your sodium levels and your potassium levels in particular to be maintained at basically the same level no matter what your external circumstances are, whether you're running a marathon, whether you're sitting at your desk, whether it's 110 degrees out or whether it's 10 below. It's important that you retain stable levels of salts. And that's really another word for those salts are electrolytes. And so sodium chloride, table salt, once it gets into solution, it separates into both the sodium and the chloride, and these are, among the electrolytes that are in your blood. Calcium would be another, magnesium is another, and other aspects of your blood are the pH, and pH is a measure of whether your blood is acidic or basic, and 7 is a value of pH that indicates your acid and base are roughly neutral. They balance each other out. And in certain diseases, you can go into something called acidosis, and there's also something called alkalosis, where you're more basic than acidic. So the kidney functions to control hydrogen ions, the simplest atom there is, and probably, I think, the most common atom in the universe, but that by itself is acidic. So the kidney regulates hydrogen ions to maintain your blood as roughly pH 7.4. So it's neutral, slightly to the alkaline side. Where your urine, however, depending on your diet and other factors, may be anywhere from a pH of about 5 to a pH of about 8. It can really vary. The pH number is a logarithmic number, so going from pH 7 to pH 8 means 10 times more alkaline. Going from pH 7 to pH 6 means 10 times more acidic. So those are the homeostatic actions of the kidney, and also involved in homeostasis is hormone synthesis and secretion. Now, I talked about the adrenal glands. Those are very obviously endocrine organs. They're there to make hormones, and they're what makes your heart race. If somebody sneaks behind you and does a cymbal crash, or your adrenals dumping epinephrine. But the kidney is a hormonal synthesizer in and of itself, and I think this may be a piece of information that may be new to some of you, but it is critical in vitamin D and in hormones that can raise your blood pressure. So this is another function that in some kidney diseases is pretty well maintained, and in other diseases this function is not as well maintained and can lead to the symptoms of the renal disease. So homeostasis, I think you now know, is not just a footnote. It's really the concept of what is inside and what is outside, and your organs are either inside or outside. Now, I'm sure you all think of your organs as inside, but if you think about your lungs, from your mouth and nose to the farthest part of your lung is really all connected to the outside, meaning the air that we breathe. So that we have to regulate and protect against pollen in the air, bacteria that may be in the air, fungi that are in the air. The point being that the lungs, even though they sit inside our thorax, are actually outside, so to speak. And it's the same thing with our GI tract. From your mouth to the other end is really, if you think about it, a big long tube, a very complicated tube, but it is all in contact with the outside. And so your mouth is really the entryway to your external environment in many ways. It's what you eat, what you drink, what you breathe, and it really maintains itself on the outside, and your immune system is there to, again, maintain homeostasis so that if you do happen to eat food that has bacteria in it that are harmful or breathe them in, that in most cases your immune system is able to deal with them. So on the inside, and this means parts of your body that really don't have access to the outside, are your blood. That's completely internal. And so temperature, water and salt content that we've already talked about, the various blood cell types that are going through your blood, the number of those cells, glucose, proteins, salt, we talked about pH. These are all closely regulated, and unlike the gut and the GI tract, these are all inside your body. And the kidneys actually, in many ways, are both inside and outside. If you think of the kidney and its connection to urine flow, urine obviously goes from inside to outside. So your urinary tract, in much the same way as your respiratory tract and your GI tract, again, is connected with the outside. So you have to protect against bacteria. I mentioned that the urine is normally contains no bacteria. It's sterile, and that's another homeostatic process that the urinary tract system does. So this sort of gives you an idea of, in a little lunchbox, I hope this is not too fuzzy for you, but that you can see that food, salt, and water enter the GI tract, and you can see that they go through this long tube. It's bigger here. That's probably the stomach in this very simplified diagram. And ultimately, the waste and undigested material is eliminated. The respiratory tract is the same thing. The air goes in, the air goes out. The urinary system, again, the urine goes out. And what's inside are all the cells of your body and the circulatory system. And you see that the circulatory system interacts in very important ways with your GI tract, because what you eat has to end up in your blood. It oxygenates your blood, and this happens via the heart and lungs. And it also sends the blood to be filtered by the urinary system. So that's really what we want to talk about, the urinary system, both inside and outside. So the basic unit of the kidney is the nephron, and I've talked about this in some of my early webinars, and it has two basic parts, and I've really stressed the tubule, the second sub-bullet here, but the glomerulus, which I haven't talked about as much because it's really not the key site of PKD, is where the filtration of the blood actually occurs. And this is a very beautiful structure for an electron microscopist like me. It contains interesting cells called podocytes that actually have little filter areas where the water portion of your blood can get through, but not the blood cells. So seeing blood in your urine obviously is not normal. And if you see white cells in your urine, that's probably indicates an infection. So what the glomerulus does is separate the water phase from the cellular phase in the blood. And it also keeps the big proteins like albumin also in your blood. So if you see big proteins in your urine, that's also an indication that the glomerulus is leaking things that it should not be leaking. But it does remove a lot of water every minute of every day, and the tubule, which is the second basic part of the nephron, and we've talked about this because this is where cysts form in polycystic kidney disease, spends most of its time reabsorbing all that water that comes out of the blood. And when I say water, it's really, water plus salt plus small molecules that are the byproduct of what you eat, are the byproduct of your muscle when it works, and really to maintain ourselves as being out of the ocean in a dry environment, the kidney really has to absorb about 99% of that filtrate. So that the normal kidney, it's taking 25% of your blood each minute, and that means that virtually all of your blood is filtered in a very short amount of time, and then it's filtered again and again and again. This is a constant process. And it's really pretty amazing that you can separate this salt water from the blood and return it all back so that, yes, you do lose some water during the day. That's why we get thirsty. And if you're thirsty, you probably already should have had some water. So the kidney is really pretty amazing in that 25% of the blood goes through the kidneys. A lot goes through your brain, a very important organ other than the kidneys, of course. But unlike the brain, which weighs a substantial amount, the kidneys, both of them together, under normal circumstances, is less than 1% of your total body weight. So 25% of your blood is devoted to your kidneys, even though they're really only 1% of your body weight. Not all of this goes to the kidneys because they need the oxygen and the blood nutrients, but it's also for the filtration process. And so here we get to a little bit of what the anatomy looks like. You saw in the very first slide, I showed you the lighter pink, which is the cortex, and the little darker pink rays, which is the medulla. And if you magnify that little square, you see that you have glomeruli, which are these little circular areas. Some of them are close to the edge of the kidney, and up here would be the capsule of the kidney. And some of them are closer to the renal medulla. And I'm not going to talk about the difference between these nephrons, but they do serve slightly different functions. And then you see that after the filtration, if you can follow my little arrow, they go through this very complicated tubular system. There's the proximal tubular system and the distal tubular system. And interestingly, each nephron, when it goes down into the medulla and then comes back, reattaches, not really attach, but actually through connective tissue, it does attach a little bit to the same glomerulus from which it came from. So the blood is filtered, goes through this complex tubular system, and it makes a little pass by the same glomerulus from which it started before it goes back into the circulatory system. And I'll talk a little more about this particular area because it's actually important to maintaining your blood pressure. So I'm not showing, but I'll show on a slide coming up, the blood supply for the kidney, but this just shows these blue tubules that collect, and you can see how there are various other tubules that are entering this collecting duct into the calyx, which is where the urine accumulates, goes through the ureters into your bladder. So this is the basic unit of the kidney. It's pretty complex, and if you really start magnifying and looking at all the various different cells that comprise the kidney, it's really an amazing organ. So I just wanted to show you the blood supply, where all that 25% of your blood is going, and there's something called an interlobular artery, which is large, and then an afferent arteriole, and I'm sorry if you're seeing the web, but that could be useful. You can look up more about that particular item, but it goes into something called the afferent arteriole, and it goes into the glomerulus, and the blood goes into this cup-shaped area called the glomerular capsule and into the proximal tubule. And you can see that the blood supply continues out of the glomerulus, minus a lot of its water, and this is called the efferent arteriole, and it goes on to supply the whole nephron. So it gives a blood supply to the glomerulus, and it also gives a blood supply to the tubules. And down at the bottom of the nephron, that's of particular importance, and I'll talk about that a little more. And again, you see that the urine collects by these various branches from adjacent glomeruli, and this urine flows and collects in the pelvis of the kidney. So two important things, the blood supply for the kidney and the tubule and glomerulus of the kidney and the collecting ducts. So this functional kidney unit reabsorbs, as I mentioned before, 99% of that glomerular filtrate. So you're really only losing 1%, and that's pretty impressive when you think about it. The proximal tubule, which is what comes right after the glomerulus, which is doing all the filtering, extensively reabsorbs the filtrate, and it also secretes certain substances into it. Now, I've included a term here called SIP. This is just a reference to the type of protein or enzyme. It lights up at a certain wavelength. If you're a biochemist, it's called a cytochrome P450, actually. Again, no need to remember any of this, but most people think of these enzymes as belonging to the liver, and they do. Most drugs that you take are metabolized by the liver, and these cytochrome P450 enzymes do the metabolizing. The reason it's important in the kidney, and the reason some drugs are toxic to the kidney, is that when drugs are metabolized, whether it's in the liver, or whether it's in the kidney, or whether it's in the gut, where some of this metabolism occurs, sometimes you get what's called an active metabolite. Now, a metabolite, very simply, is what the liver and the kidney and the gut breaks down drugs into. But sometimes these metabolites are very active, and they bind to your DNA, or they bind to certain proteins, and they can become toxic. So certain drugs, and antibiotics in particular of certain types, can be activated in the kidney, and that's why you have to be very careful, especially if you already have kidney disease, to avoid certain antibiotics unless they're absolutely the only antibiotic that you can take that will get rid of an infection. So a good physician knows which antibiotics are safe for the kidney and has to weigh the benefits and risks of curing the infection or taking a certain risk of injuring the kidney. In most cases, this can be avoided by a lot of fluid, and in most normal individuals, these drugs can be used safely. So in the thin loop of Henle, I showed you in the previous slide those loops that sort of go into the medulla of the kidney. They also do a lot of resorption of fluids. They don't have these enzymes, so they're not as susceptible to active metabolites that might injure. And then the distal tubule, again, is resorbing fluids because the whole nephron, frankly, has to keep doing this to get 99% of the water back into your blood. And it also regulates acid-base balance so that your blood pH stays where it should be. And again, this is a major and basic homeostatic function of the kidney. And the collecting ducts are not just passive pipes that collect urine, but they respond to a hormone that I've talked about previously called vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone. And this is what tells your body, particularly if you're hot and sweating, to make your urine more concentrated so you can conserve more water. But for people with PKD, vasopressin can actually be your enemy because it also can cause proliferation of cells that have the PKD gene. So tolvaptan, as many of you have heard about, antagonizes the action of vasopressin. It also makes you thirsty and it makes you urinate more, but it keeps you hydrated and it's protective of your cysts growing as fast as they do. So this is sort of a cartoon. You see our little chemists adding a few things to the blood, taking a few things out. You can see that the big proteins are not filtered, and then they go through this tortuous route in the proximal tubule down into the loop of Henle, where the salt concentration is actually very high, and this creates a gradient between what's in the tubule and what's in the tissue between the tubule, called parenchyma, which is a general term, not just for the kidney. And by osmosis, molecules tend to move from where they're highly concentrated to try to sort of even up on both sides. And so these salt pumps counteract that and really keep your salt homeostatically controlled. In other words, that you don't become, your blood doesn't become too salty, or it doesn't have too little salt, both of which can be problems. So this is really what's going on, and it's one of the things that I found about these illustrations is that they never show that the distal tubule actually comes back to the nephron or the glomerulus from which it started. And we'll talk about the fact that it does, even though the cartoons usually don't show it, and why that's important. So what happens in this medulla of the kidney, and I'm not sure I could even describe this really all that well, but mammalian kidneys, fish are different because they live in water. Some desert animals can survive without drinking water at all. They get their water from their prey, what they eat, whether it be plants or other animals. But the mammalian kidneys use a countercurrent exchange to remove water from the urine so that the body can retain the water, and that helps move nitrogenous waste products. Now again, another word, nitrogenous comes from the word nitrogen, and proteins, which is a lot of our diet, produces a lot of nitrogenous waste. In other words, it contains nitrogen. The air we breathe is 80% nitrogen, and the amino acids that comprise proteins that are part of our diet, whether they come from plants or animals, produce waste products that, if they accumulate, really make you feel pretty bad, and is really one of the reasons that you go into end-stage renal failure, that you no longer can use this complicated but elegant mechanism to get rid of these waste products. So this is not meant as something that you need to know all the details about, but I think you can just see from the curvature of the arrows and how things flow and how the numbers changes, that even without explaining it all, you can see that this is a really elegant process that has evolved over millions of years to allow us to be in a non-aqueous environment. In other words, we live on the earth, not in the oceans. And the kidney, unlike liver and some other organs, contains many, many different kinds of cells. And since I'm a cell biologist, I thought I'd just have to show this because I think it's beautiful for number one, but it also shows you that when you really study what these cells look like and what they do, it begins to make sense. In other words, structure follows function. So the proximal tubules have a certain type of cell where the nucleus, which is the dark purple, sort of sits up near the surface of the cell, whereas if you look at the distal tubule, which does different functions, the nuclei, again the dark purple, sit in a different place in the cells. And in the medulla, where all that countercurrent exchange is occurring, you can see these cells are very thin, and you almost can't tell the difference between the kidney tubules in the loop of Henle from the blood vessels that are in the loop of Henle. And this just illustrates 4 basic areas of the kidney, but all told, the kidney has dozens of different kinds of cell types. And they're all required to do what the kidney does and does well. So what about the hormonal functions of the kidney? Well, one of the most important hormones that the kidney produces is erythropoietin. Erythro means erythrocyte. That's a red blood cell. And I actually was taught biochemistry by the man who went to the Chicago slaughterhouses when they still had the stockyards and collected the kidneys of thousands of cows to isolate this protein, erythropoietin, and really he discovered it the old-fashioned way. That would never occur in today's modern science, but it was amazing. He had his graduate students going down to the stockyards every day and collecting kidneys. It was a real tour de force that he isolated this hormone, which is present in extremely small amounts but has extremely large effects in your bone marrow, and it makes sure that you have enough red blood cells in your blood. When the kidneys begin to fail and don't produce erythropoietin, which fortunately in PKD usually erythropoietin is maintained to some extent, so anemia is not as bad as in other chronic kidney diseases, you become anemic. So a very important hormone. The other important hormone is that the kidney hydroxylates, meaning adding this OH group, which just means oxygen and hydrogen, and it's a vitamin D metabolite that promotes bone resorption and calcium and phosphorus absorption from the diet. So your bone health is very much related to your kidney health. And osteodystrophy is a disease that results again from kidney failure when this does not occur. So you help to produce red blood cells in the bone marrow, and the bone itself is maintained again by a critical function of the kidney. Finally, the kidney releases an important hormone called renin, renal. You can begin to see that some of these words that sound funny or difficult really define themselves. And this is secreted from an area of the kidney called the Juxtaglomerular Apparatus. So juxta, think of the word juxtaposed, it means next to, basically. So science tends to use big words. It just is that way, and that's that part of the distal nephron that comes back to its own glomerulus, so juxtaglomerular, and apparatus just means it's a combination of cells and tubules in the glomerulus that together form the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or the RAAS. And this is critical to another homeostatic function, and that is your blood pressure. So your blood pressure is something that's obviously very important. You want to, in normal circumstances, a very low blood pressure. Blood pressure changes, though, if you're exercising or in the fight or flight reaction, which is what your adrenals do. In other words, it could just be a cymbal crash behind you and you feel your heart race, or you could be prepared to fight in prehistoric days if the saber-toothed tiger is coming after you. And this apparatus, which you can see in the center of this diagram, is where the distal tubule comes back and sort of sits right between the blood supply of the glomerulus, and it senses, it's really a sensing part of the kidney that tells the kidney whether the blood flow is adequate or not. Is the salt adequate or not? And this RAAS system actually involves all sorts of organs. The liver makes the precursor to something called angiotensin, which is really the hormone that ultimately raises your blood pressure. But angiotensinogen, and when you see inogen attached to a protein name, that means a precursor protein. And the kidney, by sensing blood supply and salt in your blood, may secrete renin, which activates angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. And then the lungs, and why in the lungs, I can't give you a good answer. There's probably somebody that can. But it has an angiotensin converting enzyme, which converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And again, a big word, but angio meaning blood, tensin, you can just think of tense, meaning high blood pressure. And so your sympathetic activity goes up. That's your adrenal glands. You know, when you're nervous or you're about to give a speech in front of an audience, that's what makes your hands sweat and your heart go quicker. But it also has a lot of effects on your kidney, and it also, and this is where it's really important to your health, it affects your blood pressure. And if your arteries are always constricted, that's not a good thing. It's physiological when you need it to be, when you need high pressure for certain functions like running, but people who run and exercise frequently actually have very low resting blood pressure. So when your blood pressure goes up for the appropriate reasons, it gives you a lasting benefit. So this whole system is very complicated, and I'm not going to go through it all, but again, this is an important homeostatic function that really originates in the kidney and involves a lot of different organ systems and all of your blood vessels on the arterial side. And in kidney disease, this is one of the reasons that you have angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. So what does that mean? That in the lungs, if you take an ACE drug, as an abbreviation, this conversion from angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2 doesn't happen, and all these consequences therefore don't happen, and your blood pressure goes down. There are also angiotensin 2 receptor blockers. Those are called ARBs. They cause a similar decrease in blood pressure as the ACE inhibitors. And there are actually direct renin blockers that prevent this enzyme from the kidney from ever converting angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1 and 2. So in diseases of the kidney, many may involve primarily the glomerulus. Glomerulonephritis, and when you see itis, that typically means infection. It's not necessarily always an infection. It could just be inflammation for a variety of reasons. Some of these are genetic. Some of them are for unknown reasons, but there are a variety of glomerulonephritis syndromes, and that's that first part of the functional unit of the kidney. And the diseases may also involve the primary tubules of the nephron, and one of those diseases, and obviously why you're tuning in today, is both autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive polycystic kidney diseases. So these diseases of the kidney may involve many different cell types, directly or indirectly. It could be that the blood coming into the kidney is not coming in sufficient quantity. That's called pre-renal disease. It may be a defect in the kidney itself, like PKD, or it may be a post-renal disease, like a kidney stone, which blocks the urine, and when the urine is blocked, that also damages the kidney. So I think today, and I'm talking more than I thought I would, we see that the kidneys have a central role in homeostasis, and that the diseases of the kidney, because of this role in homeostasis, can have widespread consequences. And there are many other diseases far more common than ADPKD, such as hypertension and diabetes, that may also affect the kidneys. A different way than in PKD, but causing kidney failure nonetheless. So without dialysis or transplantation, complete loss of kidney function is not consistent with life. But fortunately, we do have these choices. With liver disease, there is no equivalent to dialysis, so a transplant is needed rather urgently because one cannot survive with a non-functioning liver either, but there is no way to compensate for liver function other than a transplant, although scientists are working on that. So I think in summary, I've probably convinced you that, and you probably already knew it before I started talking, that the kidney is a vital organ. I hope you learned that it has a few other functions than just producing urine, and that among other organs, it really allows us to make our way in the world despite our constantly changing external environment. And also, and this is of great benefit for those of us with kidney disease, that the kidneys have a large functional reserve. We're born with 2 of them. Obviously, my living donor is doing just fine with 1 kidney. That's very fortunate that we have this type of reserve, so that even with kidney diseases, we may not even feel that bad because of the extra capacity that most people are born with. So with that, I'll stop and try to answer any questions that you may have. And I'm just putting up so that you can see that there are upcoming education events like this webinar that I hope you'll all tune into.
All right, we do have a few questions. One that came in pretty early on, does HRT affect cyst growth? It's not entirely related to the topic, but HRT. Maybe if the person who submitted that question can send some clarification through, then we'll come back to it. Because I was hoping you would know what that was.
I think I do, but...
Okay, well, if you could send some clarification, then we'll come back. Here is one. You mentioned antibiotics, and so we have a couple questions.
Hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So, again, this is something to discuss with your physician, obviously.
And so HRT is hormone replacement therapy.
Right. So typically, I would be thinking of estrogens. It is a question really for a physician. I think I can't answer that. It's not, to my knowledge, a huge issue with regard to kidney function itself, but I will be happy to be corrected by physicians dealing with this.
And I think that estrogen, Marie Hogan at Mayo Clinic is studying that in its relation to polycystic liver disease.
Yeah.
I think there's some bigger effects on the liver versus the kidney, and from what I know, it doesn't affect it, but that is certainly a great question and something that I'll explore with our friends at Mayo and see if they have any other comments. But yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah, estrogen is clearly offers cardiovascular protection, in younger women. There is a difference, male and female as a result of that.
Okay. So we had some questions about antibiotics, and you mentioned them at some point. Some better than others for the kidneys, and so as that relates to PKD, is there a family of antibiotics that are specifically better or worse for PKD patients? And then one person has specifically asked about antibiotics for someone in stage 4. So do you have any knowledge?
I can't answer about particular stages of chronic kidney disease. However, one of the key elements about antibiotics for polycystic kidney disease is whether the antibiotic can actually get into the cyst. If you have a cyst infection, there are only certain antibiotics that can actually get into that cyst fluid and attack the bacteria in the cyst. If it's a simple urinary tract infection that has not reached the kidneys, then the choice of antibiotics is much greater. But if it's an infection that is actually in the kidney and in the cysts of the kidney, many antibiotics just don't get there. And like any other antibiotic treatment for any other infection in different organs, all these things have to be taken into account. I think the quinolone antibiotics may get into the cysts. They have side effects, as do all drugs, but I don't think they're particularly toxic to the kidney necessarily. Again, that's something that your physician needs to decide.
And then we had another question come in when you were talking about sort of maintaining an alkaline and talking about homeostasis. Someone wants to know if maintaining an alkaline diet would help control cyst growth at all.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Certainly, diets that favor the kidney, and there are many such diets. They're difficult because you need a certain amount of protein, and protein, as we discussed, creates nitrogenous wastes. So you want to minimize the work of the kidney in eliminating those. But even if you're a vegetarian, you're still taking care to eat beans and other sources of vegetable protein. It's, again, something to ask your physician in terms of whether your urine is acidic or alkaline as a result of diet. I think in many cases there are some myths about certain dietary additions that you want to confirm with your physician, like cranberries and this sort of thing. But physicians can manipulate the pH of your urine either through instruction in terms of diet or, I think, with medication, if that's of importance.
And I will add on to that and just say that it's really important to just maintain a general healthy diet overall and drink a lot of water unless you're on dialysis. And be sure to consult your nephrologist or your physician if you want to make any drastic changes to your diet. Okay, and then we did have a question come in via email earlier in the month, and they were asking about kidney function and blood pressure, and I think that you addressed that fairly well, so we'll move past that. But they also asked about gout, and I know we spoke a little bit about this before the webinar. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything on there.
Yeah, so as someone who has PKD and has had gout, although not since my transplant, gout used to be called the rich man's disease, and that the kings of Europe tended to have it because they were the only ones that really had a rich diet. They ate a lot of foie gras, and but it is a metabolic disease primarily, and it does seem to present a slightly increased involvement with kidney disease, and that may have more to do with how dilute or how concentrated your urine is and whether it's conducive to forming stones. When you have kidney stones, they can be of all sorts of different composition. Some are uric acid stones, which is related to gout, but other stones may not be made up of urates or uric acid. But gout itself is really treated by rheumatologists, not by nephrologists, because it typically affects your joints. However, the classic swollen, red, hot, big toe, which is typical of gout, that's an arthritic condition, but gout also is not good for your kidneys, so you want to control your uric acid levels in your blood that are one of the issues that lead to gout.
Okay. And just, we have 3 more minutes, so I'm going to ask 1, maybe 2 more questions. Someone wants to know, why does it appear the kidneys enlarge when one is dehydrated?
I'm not aware personally of any study that would show that the kidneys actually change size relative to your degree of hydration, because the kidneys are enclosed in a capsule that I showed very briefly, which is sort of a connective tissue cocoon that makes, the shape of the kidney and keeps it roughly the same size. It's one of the reasons that polycystic kidneys can be very painful, because they press on that capsule, and that capsule has nerves in it, and when it's stretched, it produces pain. So I don't know that, if one day you just neglect to drink water, that your kidneys get bigger. I'd have to refer that to somebody who knows more than I do.
Yeah, I haven't heard that one either, so yeah. Maybe we'll explore that more with one of our physicians. Okay, last question. Okay, this is not a kidney function question, but I think it's an extremely important one to be addressed. Why do people who have had transplants, whether even if they have or maybe have not had their PKD kidneys removed, say they still have PKD?
That's a great question. PKD is thought of as a renal disease. However, cysts that form as a result of the PKD mutation, typically in the polycystin-1 protein, which is part of a piece of the cell called the cilium, which I've talked about before, is also present in the biliary tract of the liver. And so most people who are 60 or older and probably younger with PKD will have cysts in their liver, which don't really harm the function of the liver, but the liver can get so big, particularly in women, that you actually may need a liver transplant, not because of liver failure, but because it literally compresses all the other organs in your abdomen. Cysts are also found in the pancreas, in the thyroid. They affect the vasculature, so in some families, aneurysms in the cerebral blood vessels are part of the disease. So even after transplant, you still have to be followed for some of these other aspects of polycystic kidney disease.
Very good, thank you. That is all the time we have. It is 1 p.m. on the dot Central Time. So thank you, David, for the information you provided. Do register for the next couple of webinar Wednesdays. We've got next month talking about pioglitazone, or Actos, which is a drug that is just starting to be considered a potential therapy for PKD. And so David will have a guest with him, Bonnie Blazer-Yost, and she's working on that study. And then we'll talk about the genetics of PKD in November. Thank you to the audience for participating, submitting your questions, and being on the webinar this afternoon. We do appreciate the opportunity to provide you with the best possible education we can. I'll send out a quick survey. Last time I didn't send it out till a little bit late, so I promised to get it out this week so that it's fresh in your mind. And we'll send that out for you to just give us some feedback on how this is going. If you need to reach out to us directly, let us know. You can email us at education@pkdcure.org, or you can always tweet or Facebook us as well. On behalf of everyone here at the PKD Foundation, have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us.